Ladies and gentlemen, it gives me great pleasure to welcome you this evening for a conversation on prospects for a free Palestine with Miko Peled. Mr. Peled, a prominent advocate for Palestinian rights, one of the clearest voices that supports the Palestinian call for boycott, divestment, and sanctions, BDS, and the creation of a single democracy with equal rights in all of Palestine. He is the author of Injustice, The Story of the Holy Land, Foundation 5, and The General's Son, The Journey of an Israeli in Palestine, and the founder of Dar al-Hurriya. Dar al-Hurriya is an organization based out of Washington, D.C., that seeks to educate and cultivate for a better understanding of Palestine, its culture, and history. Proceeds from tonight's event will be donated to the Jordanian Hashemite charity organization and Dar al-Hurriya. I would like to take this opportunity and thank the Rainbow Theatre for organizing this event, part of the Rainbow Inspire series. Before our discussion begins, we have a short video that highlights Miko's activism and commitment to a cause that we all hold dear and near to our hearts. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Miko Peled. Welcome to Amman, Miko. It's always great to see you and listen to what you have to tell us tonight.
Thank you so much. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here again. Thank you.
We're very excited to hear your insights at this extremely precarious time on what is happening in Palestine and particularly in Gaza. We're going to start with who is Miko. So you were born in Jerusalem to a Zionist family, where your grandfather signed Israel's Declaration of Independence. Your father was a general in the army, fought in the 1948 Arab-Israeli War. You joined Israel's Special Forces after high school. That shows a deep entrenchment to a cause. Today, there's a different Miko Peled sitting here with us. So who's Miko? Can you tell us a story?
Well, first of all, I want to say thank you once again to the organizers and to the Rainbow Theatre. And thank you for doing this. And I want to recognize a special guest that we have here today. His name is Isa Amro. Isa, yes. Would you please stand up? Please. Isa is not only a special guest, he's a special friend, more than a friend, a colleague, an incredible leader, a courageous man. When people say, as they often do about Palestinians, where is the Palestinian Gandhi? Where is the Palestinian Mandela? Isa certainly is a personification of that. I always say, I think Mandela and Martin Luther King are looking down when they see Isa, and they salute. And I'll get to your question in just a second, but I just want to say I think that it's tragic. The whole reality in Palestine, of course, is tragic, but it's tragic that a man who has dedicated his life not only to free his people and his community, but equally dedicated to doing this in a nonviolent way. His dedication to nonviolence is almost religious. That a man like that has to live in fear for his life. And we were talking before, some of you know I was in Brussels just a few days ago at the European Parliament. They hosted an event about Palestine. And I mentioned Isa and the fact that he is afraid for his life. He can't take a step in his own city, in Hebron, without fearing for his life. And where are the Europeans and where are the Americans And why are we not protecting, and why are we not putting in place guarantees that will safeguard his life and his family? And so I can't tell you what it means to me to have him here today. I'm very happy that he came, that he was able to come and be with us today. So thank you, Asa, again.
We're very happy to have Asa with us as well. Asa arrived this evening, actually. Yeah.
So back to your question. Who is Miko today? What people tell me, people that I know, people who knew me, people who are activists, but not quite perhaps as active as I am, the line that I hear most, and this is again people from the other side, say, you've crossed the line. You've crossed the line. I mean, it's fine to be pro-peace, pro-Palestinian a little bit, but you've gone too far. And they say to me things like, we agree with you 95%. And you have to wonder, what is that 5%? What does that 5% represent? And as far as I can tell, the 5%, we see expression of that 5% when we see Israelis supporting the slaughter in Gaza. So the 5% is actually willing to stand up and say Palestinians have rights just as we do. Palestinians are equal. Palestinians should not be killed. That is the 5%, standing against this enormous, brutal war machine and demanding not only to stop it, but to dismantle it. So this is what I say today. This is where I stand today.
Right, but you grew up in a Zionist home. How did the shift come about? And you served in the Israeli armed forces as well.
Yeah, regrettably, I did serve in the Israeli army. I always say I wish I knew then what I know today, and I wish that there were people in my environment that would have encouraged that. But, I grew up, my father was a general, so refusing to serve in the army was not part of the conversation ever. The change is always gradual. I mean, when you look back, especially when I was working on the book, The General's Son, then, you remember things that kind of, the first cracks in this wall of indoctrination, of this, total support for Zionism and for the state of Israel and the Israeli army. It was gradual, but probably the biggest thrust, and I think this is true for anyone, the things that make us, force us to shift our worldview, the things or the circumstances that force us to do that are usually tragic. That's when we're forced to finally take a look at our world and take a look at our life and take a look at what's going on and demand more and demand a deeper understanding. And as many of you know, and as I mentioned in the book, this happened to me personally. My experience of that was when in 1997, on the 4th of September, my sister's little girl was killed in a suicide mission in Jerusalem. And when a 12, 13-year-old girl is killed, that's precisely the kind of horror that forces you to take a deeper look at everything you think is true, everything you believe in, and then re-examine it. And what happens is, because violence has become so normalized, when we talk about Palestine, we never stop, we never pause, we never say, wait, what actually happened here? Now, this was a long time ago, 1997. How many Palestinians, how many people were killed, how many horrors have we seen since then? But when we look just at that one event, when 3 young men decided to blow themselves up, how do we move on beyond that? How do we not stop everything and say, wait a minute, how did we allow this to happen? What kind of an environment was created that allowed this to happen? 3 young men killing themselves and then killing other people in the process. And I think part of the problem is that it's become so normalized that we never do that. And then we see what is happening now in Gaza, and it's people treat it like it's just one more in a long chain of violence that has become normalized. And from that moment on, it wasn't immediate, obviously. It took several years, it took time, but that was what thrust me into this journey, which I call the journey of an Israeli into Palestine, which in this movie is expressed, I think, quite well by my Palestinian friends, and led me to the conclusions that I express today.
Going back to the short film played now, I mean, throughout this time, there were massacres, displacements, violence was still going on. But how do people like the Palestinian people we saw in the video and that elderly gentleman take the general's son as a friend and an ally?
Well, you'd have to ask them. I mean, you could certainly ask Isa. I think Bassem Tamimi said it well when he says, you know, how can I possibly accept you? And the truth is that there was a kindness and a tolerance that I always sensed from the Palestinians, because, you know, transformation takes time. And whether it was Palestinians in Palestine or whether it was Palestinians that I met initially in the United States, it was never forced. I was always allowed to take the time that I needed to walk from this one place that was very secure and safe, find my way to this other shore, if you will. You know, like a baby just learning to walk, you know, and stumbling along the way. And it wouldn't have happened if it wasn't for the generosity and the tolerance and kindness that I received from Palestinians. There was never a finger pointed at me, ever, in any encounter that I've ever had with Palestinians.
Although growing up in Jerusalem, you said you never interacted with Palestinians, you never talked to Palestinians, or had nothing to do with them. So what did you think of them before the late 90s where you first met them for the first time and had that dialogue? But growing up, what did you think, what were you taught?
Well, it was, first of all, I don't like the them. I don't like to use that term, them, but I know what you're saying. I mean, I know what you're saying. Because having grown up and having been indoctrinated the way I was, there was a them, you know, and the word Palestinian didn't really enter the lexicon or the conversation till very late. I mean, I don't think I heard the term Palestine or Palestinians. Palestine, yes, but not Palestinians till I was maybe in high school. And that's only because of my father's work with Palestinians and the conversation that were taking place at home with him. But they were, first of all, dangerous. I mean, when I was growing up, and as many of you I'm sure know, there was no wall, there were no checkpoints. I could go from where I lived, I grew up in Jerusalem, to East Jerusalem, but nobody ever did. You wouldn't dream of going into a Palestinian neighborhood because the wall was already built here. We didn't need a checkpoint. We didn't need these big red signs telling us that it's dangerous and so on to cross to the other side, because it was so built so solidly in here. So we know that they're dangerous, and we know that they can't be trusted. And then again, the they, which now of course, this whole idea of a they is something that I reject. But any of the negative characteristics that colonizers usually use to describe the colonized are used by Israelis, and then it comes with a whole books and books filled with lies about the history, and these lies are the buildup. They're the foundation for the racist characteristics that we learn about them, about the Arabs, about the Palestinians.
So the tragic death of your niece was like the trigger where you had to rethink things. One would expect anger and revenge, but neither you nor your sister nor your family felt that way.
No, we felt that way very strongly, but we felt that way towards the people that we felt were responsible, which was the state of Israel and the Israeli government. So it wasn't an issue of forgive and forget, not at all. I think we must never forgive and we must never forget until the people who are in charge, the people who have been running and operating this apartheid machine, are put in jail. I don't think there should be any forgiveness or forget, but I think it's important to direct that to the people who are actually responsible, to the people who caused this tragedy. And so if we direct it correctly, then it's the people that that have been operating this, and it's Netanyahu. Before that was somebody else. It doesn't really matter, but the people that have been operating this apartheid state for 75 years are the people to whom this anger and this desire for justice is addressed to.
So you're in the United States. in the late 90s, that you met Palestinians for the first time, and you heard the Palestinian side of the story in 1948.
Yes, and I'm sitting in a Palestinian home. A good friend of mine, Majid Khouri, who has family here in Amman. Maybe you know, some of you know the family, know him. And the Palestinians are, and this was a kind of an environment where people just tell their story. Nobody's accusing anybody or anything like that. And they're telling me that day is night and night is day. They're telling me that the world is flat. They're telling me things that could not possibly be true. And I'm looking at these people. These are intelligent people, educated people, you know, people who I've grown to like. And the response that other, you know, American Jews or Israelis that would come and go and were part of these encounters would be like, oh, they're all liars, they're all terrorists, and they would leave. And I'm like, they can't all be terrorists, and they couldn't all have been conspiring to create this one same story. And so I began engaging in my own research, and then books like Ilan Pappé's book and some of the other Israeli historians had come out at that time, and so I began, investigating myself, and then traveling, embarking on these trips into Palestine, that journey of an Israeli into Palestine. So that was the beginning, and then eventually I had to make a choice. Was I going to remain loyal to the indoctrination and the stories that I was taught as a kid, as a child growing up, not only in school, but at home around the dinner table? I mean, in my family, there was not a single conversation that did not have at least one aspect of how did we contribute to the state today? How did we sacrifice for the state today? You know, all the great things and all the people around me that I knew all contributed and fought hard for the state, for the Zionist idea. And so I had to either remain loyal to that, which I increasingly became less and less comfortable with, or follow these other values, which I, interestingly enough, was taught probably mostly by my mother, which had to do with humanity and equality and admiring people like Nelson Mandela and others who fought for freedom. And eventually I'd come to an intersection when I had to make a choice.
But your mother, speaking of your mother, there's a part where you talk about her refusing to take a home was offered to her, right? So can you tell us about that?
Yes, this is a story that I remembered as I was writing the book, and then I went back and talked to her for many, many hours about that. She always told us a story about how she was born and raised in Jerusalem, and she was 22 years old in 1948. She was already a mother. She didn't have her own home. She lived with her mother. And when the Zionist forces came and took West Jerusalem, which we didn't even realize was ever Palestinian, because West Jerusalem for us was not Palestinian. By the time I grew up, there were no Palestinians there because, as everybody here knows, the ethnic cleansing of that part of Jerusalem was absolute. And so she was telling the story about how the Zionist forces came in, kicked people out of their homes, and then she was offered one of these homes. And she refused because she couldn't stomach the idea of taking the home of another mother, of taking the home of another family. Now, growing up, I heard the story many times, but it was a strange story because we didn't do those things. We didn't kick people out of their homes. We didn't steal. We didn't loot. We didn't, And then she would describe the looting. So that was always in the back of my mind, and again, I didn't really fully understand what this story meant until I was writing the book. And what it meant was that she was actually challenging, contradicting the national narrative, the accepted narrative, which is that we are the good guys and they came for us. But that was certainly a very serious crack in that wall of indoctrination, for sure.
So during your journey of your own investigation and going to Palestinian towns, you've done several visits to Berlin. And it was there when you saw settlements. And did that make sense to you when you saw that?
Yes, again, I mentioned that this was 2005, and Bil'in became like the mecca of activism. This small village in the West Bank, that was when what was known as the nonviolent popular resistance came out. And so I heard about this from Israeli friends, and I decided to go there. And I called some of the people there up, some of the activists, and that was my first encounter traveling by myself in a car to the West Bank. And I was terrified. Now, 5 minutes before that, if anybody asked me if I was afraid, I would have said, no, why would I be afraid? But as soon as I entered those windy roads of the West Bank, I was terrified. All these demons just jumped right forward, and just it was very hard to control them and not turn around. And then I reached Bilain, and I met with these very fine activists, and we spent the day together. And there was no wall, but Israel was already building a city on the lands of Bilain, a city. They call it a settlement. And I remember walking across into the settlement, into the city, and looking around, and settlers were moving in. And they all had literally just come off the plane. They were speaking English, they were speaking French. You know, the Palestinians, of course, were speaking English, and they also spoke Hebrew very well. These settlers who took over their land didn't speak any of the languages of the land, which is funny or tragic. And then I looked around me and I said, wait a minute, this is a city. Billions of dollars have been invested. This is not going away, because this was still a time that people were talking about the two-state solution and how they'll do an exchange of land, that in exchange for taking these wonderful, rich land from Palestinians, they would get something in the desert or something, who knows. And I thought, this is absurd. And then it dawned on me that this whole concept of a two-state solution was also a lie, was also built on a lie. And then I came back to the U.S. and I began talking about how this was a lie, and really the only, if we're talking about a peaceful resolution of Palestine, of the issue of Palestine, it had to be a single democracy with equal rights. Because why wouldn't we want one? What would the advantage of having anything else? But seeing these buildings, seeing these massive cities built in the West Bank made it absolutely clear to me that I was lied to even more than I ever thought.
Well, in this crazy world we live in right now, some people, or a lot of people, don't differentiate between Zionism and Judaism. What would your response be to that? And is there a difference between a moderate or a liberal Zionist and a right-wing Zionist?
So let's start with the first part. That's the easier part. And again, I don't think I'm saying anything that people here don't already appreciate, but Judaism is a religion. It has nothing to do with nationality. The Zionists invented the idea that Jews are some kind of a nation that has a country and a language and so on, which is an idea that's completely foreign to Jews, especially at the time. And the resistance by Jews, the early 20th century to Zionism was very strong. And so there was this hijacking of what Judaism is by the Zionists. And at the same time, there was a rejection by Zionists of Judaism. So as a good Israeli, as a good Zionist, you learn to hate the Arabs and you learn to hate the Jews, the Orthodox Jews, the ones who've always resisted and rejected Zionism, the ones who reject the army and won't serve in the army, even the ones in Palestine, the ones who burn the Israeli flag, on the Israeli Independence Day. We learn to hate them, of course. But the difference between Judaism and Zionism couldn't be more striking. It's night and day. And the Zionists really hijacked this idea of what Judaism is and created something that is completely false. And I think that's really, really important to understand. Zionism, like any other racist, supremacist ideology, should be rejected completely. Judaism is a religion, and you have Jews who are, Arab Jews and Polish Jews and whatever, all kinds of different Jews. What unites Jews, and this is something that was written by a rabbi that is considered one of the greatest rabbis, who lived in the 12th century in Baghdad. He was an Arab Jew. In Hebrew, they call him Saadia Gaon. I think his name was Saadia ibn Yusuf or something, his full Arabic name. But he wrote that Jews are a nation united by a faith. He didn't say faith, he said the religious law. He used the word Sharia. The religious law is what unites Jews. That's why you can be an Iraqi Jew and a Ukrainian Jew, and you're still Jewish, but you're completely different. Now, Zionism is a racist, violent ideology. And when we look at what Zionism created, I think it's obvious. Look at the state of Israel. That is what Zionism created. And look what they've done over the last 75 years. To somehow claim that you can be slightly more moderate and slightly more radical is a nuance that I think is irrelevant, because at the end of the day, the state of Israel was established, and there was a consensus by Zionists of establishing the state of Israel. And it was established after what? The reason at least half the people in this room are not in Palestine now, including you, is because of what happened in 1948. A massive campaign of ethnic cleansing, a brutal campaign of genocide. And how can you be moderate if you accept that? How can you accept Zionism and somehow say that you're progressive or liberal? It doesn't make sense, to start slicing and splicing different types of Zionism. And then, actually, I have a very good Jewish friend, an old activist, who says, he puts this to the test to people, and he says, well, I reject racism. What's your position? It's very clear. You either reject racism or you don't. And we put this to the test. When you ask Zionists that question, they say, well, yes, but. Well, there's no but. You either reject Zionism or you don't. You either reject racism or you don't. So I don't accept these different shades of racism. If you support racism, you support racism.
You're a racist. Yeah. I think we finished the first part of our conversation. We're going to take a 15-minute coffee break and then come back to continue talking about the current events and what is happening in Gaza today, and then open the floor for questions from our audience.
Thank you.
Welcome back, everybody, to the conversation. Now, so much is happening in Gaza since October 7th. Stating some facts here, over 27,000 people killed, and numbers rising. There's no electricity, there's no food, no water. It's freezing weather conditions. 8,000 innocent children have been killed in the last 100 plus days, more than all armed conflicts in 2020, 21, 22 combined. This is but the tip of the iceberg of the atrocities Israel is committing against the Palestinian people in the name of self-defense. So this is Gaza today. How do you explain this catastrophe?
Well, I don't know that it's possible to explain a catastrophe like this other than to say, what were we expecting? I mean, I think this was predictable and preventable. This catastrophe was predictable and was preventable, just like the one before that, and just like the one before that. And like I said earlier, a regime that starts, that is founded after this massive campaign of ethnic cleansing and violence of 1947, 1948, why are we surprised? How could we not have anticipated this? There's nobody. Let me put it this way, okay? 3 years after the end of the Holocaust, 3 years after they stopped the genocide of the Jews in Europe, the world allowed the commencement of the genocide of the Palestinian people by the Zionist movement. 3 years after the end of the Holocaust, this genocide was permitted to begin. And again, it was genocide, it was ethnic cleansing, it is, not was, and the establishment of an apartheid regime. 3 crimes that are designated as crimes against humanity. So when this is the starting point, then obviously we're going to see we're going to see this continue. Now, we've got a 75-year history. And what else do we expect? People talk about peace. You can't have peace with a regime that this is their history. This is what they do. It's a racist, violent regime with a history of racism and enormous violence, of savagery. So, like I said, I don't think a healthy mind can possibly explain this violence, but it was predictable. And I'll say it again, it was preventable. And the next one we can already predict as well. Of course, this one hasn't ended yet, but we can predict that there will be more.
But the world wants to believe that it all started on October 7th.
The world wants to believe all kinds of things, but that's neither here nor there. You know, somehow, the reason the world wants to believe this, or the reason this narrative is catching on, that somehow October 7th was the beginning of something, is because they don't want to tell the truth. Because telling the truth would force them to act. And action means to act against the state of Israel. So it's a lot easier to say, well, everything was fine until these Palestinian terrorists came up and decided to do this thing that they did. Wait a minute, why is there a Gaza Strip? Who created this humanitarian catastrophe that, by the way, has been a humanitarian catastrophe since it was established? You know, so I mean, it's a twisting of the narrative. It's a twisting of the reality in order to always place the blame on the Palestinians and show that Israel all that Israel ever wanted, you know, was to live in peace with its neighbors and so forth. So it's a twisting of the reality, and this is why. And I'll say one more thing. This is also why these rumors, these nasty rumors about the killing and the rape and so on, has taken hold as well. It's being planted in a ground that is fertile, that is ready for this kind of racism. The racism of, you know, crazed Arabs and Muslims, you know, raping white women and murdering and so on and so forth. This is already part of the narrative that exists. So building on that is very, very easy. But I think it's important to put things in historical perspective.
So Israel's key supporters, and the US being top of that list, are always defending. Like as soon as the October 7th event, US congressmen flew in to show support, Europeans and so forth. And until today, they stopped short of calling it a genocide. And the narrative of Israel has the right to defend itself. If you criticize Israel, you're anti-Semitic. So many people lost their jobs just for showing sympathy. So how do you counter this narrative?
You counter it by countering it. You counter it by telling the truth. Now, the problem is that the Zionists have been doing this for over 100 years. They've been presenting this very compelling story, which is a myth. It's based on lies, but it's a very compelling story of the Jews returning after the Holocaust and after thousands of years of exile, and now they're being attacked by these vicious Arabs. And they're very good at it. And over the 100 or so years that they've been doing it, they were able to develop very strong relationships. If we're talking about the United States, with cultural relationships and relationships with the media and relationships with politicians and through philanthropy and on and on and on, every aspect of American social life, the Zionists are there. And there's nobody presenting the other side. There's no institutional effort to present the Palestinian case. And so in the absence of that, even if you take away the interests and the politics, how would an American politician, how would an American period know that there's another story? It's never been presented. The Zionist story is presented in schools, in synagogues, in churches, in the media, in movies, in culture, anywhere you go and everywhere you go. Every kid in America goes to a Holocaust museum. And when you go to a Holocaust museum, by the way, there's also images of Palestinian quote-unquote terrorism. It's all been bunched up together. There is no institution that presents the Palestinian case in a compelling, methodical, strategic way. And in the absence of that, they're always going to win.
So now we move on to the International Court finally issuing provisional measures in a case brought by South Africa against Israel and its breaches of the genocide conventions. Again, it does not call on Israel to suspend its military operation, and there's no mention of ceasefire. They gave them a month to present a detailed report. Too many that was, you can kill some more, you have a month. I guess people hoped for more. Did you think the ICJ ruling was an achievement?
I'm the wrong person to ask, because I am sick and tired of always being willing to be happy with the little crumbs that are being presented for Palestinians. You know, so whenever it comes to the Palestinian cause, Palestinians need to be happy with the bare minimum. You know, they put up the Palestinian flag in the UN. Fantastic, wow. Another country recognized the state of Palestine. Wow, incredible achievement. It hasn't helped a single Palestinian. It hasn't saved a single Palestinian child. It hasn't changed the reality in Palestine on the ground, not one iota. You know, what would be appropriate? Let's talk about what would be appropriate. What would be appropriate is a demand for immediate sanctions, an immediate lifting of the siege on Gaza, a calling for immediate no-fly zone and enforcing a no-fly zone over Gaza, a blockade of Israel, not a blockade of Gaza, a blockade of Israel. You know, it sounds ridiculous to say. You know, I was saying this in an interview, and you know, people didn't like it. But you know, it seems like the only responsible reaction to what is happening in Gaza is what the Yemeni forces are doing in Bab el-Mandab. You know, and they're not even recognized fully as a state. So, and of course, they're of course considered terrorists. So everybody or anybody that does anything for Palestinians is either anti-Semitic or terrorists. But Israel massacring tens of thousands of civilians, that is somehow, well, let's give them a month and see how they behave. And they let Israel monitor itself. They're asking the criminal to monitor its own crimes. You know, what are we expecting? Again, there's a 75-year history of the state of Israel. Why would anybody expect that Israel would stop? Why would anybody expect that without serious consequences, without real heavy measures, like I said, sanctions and so on, that the state of Israel would comply? And they gave the finger to the court. They announced that they were not going to comply, and then they didn't stop killing, they didn't stop doing anything that they were doing. There is an advantage, though, that finally, and again, very late in the game, it took them 75 years to accuse Israel of genocide. And so, you know, I suppose it's a good thing that they're finally, you know, this is being talked about, this is happening. But it's very little, and it's very late.
But do you think if the ruling actually called on Israel for an immediate ceasefire, would they have stopped?
No, the Israel wouldn't stop unless. Okay, let me give you another example. Okay, this is also something that I've been saying, and people think I'm nuts. The U.S. Naval Sixth Fleet is in the Mediterranean, right? Aircraft carriers should be coming there and forcing Israel to stop. They should be providing humanitarian aid to the people of Gaza immediately. That is the kind of forceful action that needs to be taken. Nothing less than that is going to work. Israel should be immediately placed under sanctions. Israel should be kicked out of every international arena. Embassies should be closed down. Israeli ambassadors should be sent home. That's the kind of action that is required. You know, and nothing less than that is going to work.
So the remarks by the British Foreign Secretary yesterday that the UK could recognize the state of Palestine, to you is not.
It's not about me.
Right?
It's about
no. To you, is it promising? Is that something?
No,
is that
of course not. I think it's nonsense. I think absolutely nonsense. That if they wanted to do something, if the international community, if these countries that have recognized the state of Palestine wanted to do something significant, they need to recognize that Palestine has been occupied and has been subjected to a regime of apartheid. And again, Amnesty International gave us a report 2 years ago. 2 years ago. Nobody talks about this. Amnesty International came out with a detailed report showing that Israel has been engaged, that Israel is an apartheid regime. That is what these countries need to recognize. They need to adopt the Amnesty report. They need to close down their embassies. They need to take down Israeli flags. And that's the kind of action that's needed. Recognizing something that doesn't exist, who is that helping? I mean, everything needs to be measured, in my opinion. The standard has to be, does it prevent the death of Palestinians? Does this mean that Issa Amr is going to be safe when he goes back to Palestine? That is the only standard that these things should be measured by. And none of these actions are guaranteeing any of that.
You know that around 60% of Israeli public don't believe Israel is using enough force in Gaza. This crazy figure, coupled with messaging of without settlement there is no security. Just a few days ago, that conference on resettlement of the Gaza Strip and the occupied West Bank, attended by members of the Israeli government. Obviously, the messaging is completely different here. They're still...
I mean, this is what they believe. This is what Israelis believe. This is, I remember in 2014, during the massacre that took place in 2014, I was in Palestine. And the only time, and this is true today too, and it's always been true, the only time that there's any kind of dissent that you hear that is expressed in the media or expressed in Israeli society is when the Israeli army stops killing, when they pull out and stop killing. I remember 2014 was the last time until this time that the Israeli army dared to send ground troops into the Gaza Strip. They were hit so hard and they lost so many, and high-ranking officers as well, that they pulled out the ground forces. And the army was being criticized for pulling out because they're not going to be killing enough. That's Israeli society. I mean, this is what we've got. This is what was created. And after 75 years of an apartheid state, of racist education, of a militarized society, this is what we expect. Of course they support it. And, if they say 60%, I don't know. Look at the makeup of the Israeli Knesset, of the Israeli parliament. Israelis vote in very high numbers. They're kicking out the single member of Knesset now who dared to, agree with the ICJ and call it a genocide, Ofer Kasif. They're voting to kick him out. And there's no dissent. I mean, Israeli society, Israelis are very happy with this. They think this is okay. So this is what we're dealing with. This is what we're talking about. So I don't see any reason to be surprised by these numbers, because again, they agreed with a 1948 ethnic cleansing and genocide that, what's known as the Nakba, or the beginning of the Nakba. They all agreed with it. So of course they're going to agree with this.
Let's try and be a bit optimistic. Do you agree there's a shift? I mean, with growing sentiment towards the Palestinians, thousands of people are taking to the streets across the world. There is a reawakening to the Palestinian cause amongst maybe the younger generation, which does have a sound moral compass to it. So, again, can we be hopeful?
Hope is something that we create. Hope doesn't come from nothing. Hope is something we create. So I am hopeful. Why? Because I know what hope looks like. In my mind, I know what hope looks like. Hope looks like a free Palestine from the river to the sea, a free democratic state with equal rights, a mechanism put in place to safeguard and guarantee the lives and the safety and security of Palestinians. Mechanism put in place to allow the refugees to return, not as a bumper sticker and a slogan, but as an actual mechanisms. That's what hope looks like. So if that's what I believe hope is, then that's what I need to dedicate my time to, and that's what I do. People are always protesting after the fact. I remember, again, the previous attack, and the previous attack, and the previous attack. I'm looking at some of the interviews and videos that are of mine from the past that are being resurfacing. And I keep saying, you're protesting, but you're not demanding to prevent the next one. Protesting after the fact isn't helping. We need to be protesting to prevent the next one. We should be applying pressure to prevent the next attack. We should be applying pressure, once again, to make sure that Issa Amro is safe and secure and does not have to be afraid for his life. That's what we need to be doing. Protesting after a massacre, as great as it is, and high numbers, and people are calling to end the genocide, that's great. It's not what makes a difference. It does not reach, not in America, not in Europe, it does not reach the corridors of power where decisions are being made. It does not reach that. And until we figure out how to reach that, we're not doing enough. And, this is something that came up in the conversation I had in Brussels a few days ago. We're not doing this for ourselves. We're not doing it we're not just doing this for the Palestinians. We're doing it for our own legacy. We're going to be judged by this. Our children are going to ask us, our grandchildren are going to ask us, where did you stand? How did you let this happen? How could we possibly face our children? How could we face our Palestinian sisters and brothers when we're not doing everything we possibly can so that our officials, our government officials, our governments do more? To me, that is the only standard.
And this is where the role of the international community comes in.
Of course. And it's up to us. I mean, like they say, a politician never does the right thing unless they're forced to do it. We're going to, it's up to us to force these things. It's up to the international community, the Europeans, the Americans. It's great that all these people are protesting. It's great that, thousands of young American Jews are out there, blocking the Senate and blocking roads and bridges. It's great. It's just not enough. We need to prevent the next one, and we need to figure out how we prevent the next one. And there's only one way. There's only one way to prevent the killing of Palestinians. There's only one way to guarantee the safety and to guarantee peace, because peace is now not even something anybody talks about. But there's only one way to guarantee peace, and that is to dismantle the apartheid state and to do everything we can to establish a free, democratic Palestine from the river to the sea. That is the recipe.
The US election is coming up, and regardless of really who is in the White House, the US policy will never change. Now, Biden is losing the support of the Arab and the Muslim voters, while we've seen what Trump did when he first came to the presidency. But what would you think a Trump White House would look like? Today, Biden is imposing sanctions on Israeli settlers. I think there were 4, yeah. So, what do you see Trump's White House looking like, and will anything change?
Change is not going to come from this president or that president, or this prime minister or that prime minister. Change is going to come when politicians are faced with a choice. You either reject Zionism in Israel, or you lose your job. And that only people who can do this are the constituents. So is Trump going to be good? Of course not. Is Biden going to be good? I mean, he's already half brain dead, so he's probably not going to be any different. I mean, that is not the issue. It could be anybody. People, de Klerk, who, in South Africa, after apartheid fell, he was given the Nobel Peace Prize. I don't know why. The only reason this happened is because South Africa was on its knees, and as president of South Africa, he had no choice. There was nowhere to go. South Africa was on its knees. South African society was on its knees. They were banned. They were isolated. They couldn't play sports. You couldn't negotiate. If you invited a South African team, you were penalized. So I mean, that's where it needs to go. And then I don't really care if it's who the president is, who the prime minister is. Hell, it could be Netanyahu himself that declares the end of apartheid. It's about the pressure that we put on the politicians, to bring about the change. And then again, it could be anyone, and they're probably all going to get the Nobel Prize. Rabin, for crying out loud, will receive the Nobel Peace Prize. So, I mean, it's not about this president or that president. It's about what we do to force them to make the right choice and to support the dismantling of apartheid.
Something you believe strongly in is the BDS movement. You called it a gift. What are other things we can do?
Well, I think sanctions are obvious. I think the boycott part is something that people misunderstand. And there's this video that I was asked to do about not buying Israeli dates during Ramadan, which seems ridiculous to have to say, but you have to say it. I'll give you 2 examples of how boycott, I think, should work. So in the 2021 Olympics, there was an athlete from Algeria called Fathi Nourin, and he was a judo practitioner. And this young man, obviously worked for many, many years to be good enough to get to the Olympics, and he made it. And when he was called to step on the mat to compete with a member of the Israeli team, he put all of it on the line and said no. Now, of course, he's a hero, and he was received in Algeria as a hero, and his name will always be remembered. But it shouldn't be up to him. The Olympic should not allow Israel to have a team to begin with. That's what boycott is. It's making sure that Israel does not have a presence in the Olympics, that Israel should not have a presence in FIFA. And by the way, everybody saw Jordan won the game today, right? Yeah. So there's a cause for celebration. It's nice to have a cause to celebrate about something, when everything is so dreadful. But Israel should be kicked out of all of these. That's what boycott is about. It's boycotting the state of Israel, not just not buying the dates, which is important, but making sure that Israel doesn't have that presence. That's what's going to force Israeli society to change. That's what's going to bring about the dismantling of apartheid. So, of course, boycotting, it goes without saying that it's something that's an important tool. Demanding serious boycotts, demanding sanctions and severe sanctions. This is what it's about, and of course, divestment. It's obvious that this is such an important tool in the resistance. It's absurd that we even have to say these things, that there has to be like a special thing that people talk about. This should be taken for granted. That's how you bring down a regime. It's obvious.
Mika, my final question before we open the floor for questions from the audience. Now, again, going to after 75 plus years of massacres, displacements, and endless violence, again, Israelis are still taught to dehumanize Palestinians. It's in their DNA. The Palestinians will never forget that they were uprooted, that their land was occupied, all the crimes committed against them. It's in their DNA. How do you reconcile both DNAs?
I wouldn't say that it's in the DNA. It's in education. I mean, nobody's born a racist. You have to educate them, inject them with hate in order for people to become racists. And I've never been uprooted. I've never been subjected to apartheid or racism or violence, so I can't speak to that. But I can say, from what I know, from my interactions with Palestinians and so on. And again, I'll give you actually an example from 2014. There's something that struck me. I was taking a cab in Jerusalem, and a lot of the cab drivers in Jerusalem are Palestinians. And I was in the cab, and you could feel the tension of the driver. We're listening to the news and all this horror taking place in Gaza. And so I started speaking to him a little bit in Arabic and, kind of easing things up. And his response was, why can't we just all hold hands and end this violence? Why is this going on? Why can't we just, live together in peace? And I hear this all the time for Palestinians all day long. On the Israeli side, like I said, people were angry when the army was pulling out and stopped killing. I think at the end of the day, this is not the first time that you have two societies that have to overcome pain and then succeed in overcoming pain in order to create a better future. And I think if this is done right, and again, there's already a playbook. We've seen so many examples of this, of how this works, whether it's dictatorships in Latin America, whether it's countries that had fascist regimes, whether it's, again, apartheid in South Africa. Most people would opt, and again, I've never experienced these things, so I'm maybe not the right person to ask, but from what I sense and from the experience that I've had of seeing people and talking to people, most people want to end it so they can get up in the morning, send their kids to school, go to work, have good schools, good road, have the electricity, working and the water working, and that's what people want at the end of the day. So will some people be dedicated to revenge and angry? Of course. But you create an environment that is healing. And again, I think a South African example is a really good one. You create an environment where you demand justice and people are brought to justice. There's a great movie called Argentina 1985, which I just saw. It's a great movie about how this Argentinian prosecutor was given the job of prosecuting the generals who were just taken out of power in Argentina. These processes, they've happened. We've seen them happen. Sometimes they succeed, sometimes they don't. It takes time. But at the end of the day, we're talking about two societies that are, needless to say, highly educated, have traditions of democracy, can create a functioning, productive democracy the next day if they're given the opportunity. The key is dismantling apartheid. The key is creating a free, democratic Palestine with equal rights. The key is recognizing the crimes that were perpetrated against the Palestinians and doing everything that can be done in order to compensate. The key is allowing the refugees to return, and the key is, of course, putting the criminals, at least creating a process where the criminals are brought to justice. So it doesn't happen immediately. It's not a miracle. Mechanisms have to be put in place for all these things to happen. But I think at the end of the day, most people would opt to go on living and raise their children in this new environment, which would be a healthy environment, rather than stick to their, their anger and prefer to engage in violence.
And
That's
you
my
still
opinion.
insist it can never be a two-state solution.
Well, first of all, I don't know what the advantage of a two-state solution is. What are the virtues of a two-state solution? Let's say it was possible. Why is it a good idea? And who gets a small part? And why should Palestinians accept 20% of their homeland? I mean, I think it's a crazy idea. Why in the world should Palestinians accept it? What are the virtues? And then, oh, by the way, it's impossible to do. Israel established a single state over all of Palestine, albeit an apartheid state, but Israel established a single state over all of Palestine. So it's impossible. I don't know what the virtues of a two-state solution are to begin with. And number three, the way the two-state solution is positioned, with Palestinians get a small fraction of their country, I don't get why they should accept that. So I don't see that as something that's even worthy of discussion.
And how do you see a one-state solution working?
Well, again, one state is the reality. So the question is not one state, two state. The question is a single state that's an apartheid state, or a single state that's a free democratic Palestine with equal rights. So and again, I don't think it's a political or religious issue. It's a values issue. If anybody believes and wants to continue to see racism, violence, and the kind of savagery and brutality that we're seeing perpetrated by Israel continue, then by all means, support Israel. But anybody who has a beating heart and a thinking mind has to opt to support the idea of a free Palestine with equal rights from the river to the sea. I mean, if we want to imagine a possibility of peace, where Israelis and Palestinians actually live in peace, apartheid is obviously not going to get us there. Equality, democracy, respect for human life, respect for people's rights, humanity is how you get there. So if that's what we want to do, the single state, a single democracy with equal rights is, in my view, as far as I can see, is the recipe to get there. So why would we not opt for that?
Okay. We're going to open the floor for questions from the audience. Mike. Can we have المايك اسمع أنا مش شايفة. Sure. Please هنا يعني أنت المخرج.
Sorry. Thank you. Thank you for all you're doing. My name is Sharif Saeed. My question to you is, I agree with what you said. At the end, we need to find a situation to end the current status and create a one-state solution free of apartheid and racism and so on. And you said there are two ways to do this. One is to isolate Israel, increase the sanctions, put them to their knees, as you said, the Israelis, to accept that they need to change. And the other one is to force politicians in the world powers to either face defeat from their constituents or do the right thing. Now, I think to achieve this today, the Palestinians are on their own. I mean, the reality is the Arab world is in a different place. We cannot no more depend on Arab governments to fund campaigns or to participate in this campaign. And the Western world, okay, there are many people standing up and voicing their opinions, but they're not necessarily organized and they're not necessarily going to go out of their way to achieve this. So how can we get to what you're saying with the Palestinians on their own?
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head. The Palestinian people and the Palestinian cause is an orphan, and it's unique. If we look at other causes around the world where there was a fight for freedom, the groups that were fighting for freedom, in many cases, certainly in South Africa, they had support. They had a support system outside of their country. There were states that were supporting them. I mean, the Cubans sent tanks. Cuba sent tanks to Angola to defeat South Africa, to start defeating South Africa. So, I mean, there was certainly, and you're absolutely right, Palestinians are orphans. I don't I'm not sure that it's helpful for us, though, to see the reality and accept it as unchangeable. So, you know, the Arab regimes, the Western regimes, the United States, the African countries, you know, they also, you know, they are where they are because the conditions that led to this. But we can change these conditions. You know, we're talking about bringing about a change that will be beneficial to everyone. Beneficial to everyone. Closing down Israeli embassies, dismantling apartheid will be beneficial to everyone. Not just the people who live in Palestine, but people around Palestine as well. This is something that's going to be beneficial. So what are we doing wrong? What are we not doing enough that we are getting this message across to whatever governments, whatever countries we live in, you know? And I think that's where we're failing. We're failing because we're not organizing in order to show and demonstrate. Now, some of you know that, you know, I and several others, including a few people in this room, are working on an initiative to create a Palestinian presence in Washington, D.C., which we're calling Dar al-Hurriya, an actual place in Washington, D.C. that pushes the Palestinian agenda forward. And I think that until things change in Washington, D.C., they're not going to change in any other place because everybody follows America, sadly. So that is an initiative that can be duplicated and replicated around the world. There should be one in Paris, in Rome, I mean, in any other capital, but a place that is an institution that is dedicated to presenting in a compelling, strategic way, professional way, presenting the case for a free Palestine. It's never been done. And one of the reasons it's not happening is because it's never been done. So I think it's an idea that absolutely has to happen. And like I said, we're working on making it happen in Washington, D.C., but can and should happen everywhere else, because until we present it, and it doesn't matter what country we live in, because we're not presenting something that's negative or that's going to hurt anyone. We're presenting something that's going to help everyone. So organizing in that manner, and again, usually anything that has to do with Palestine is done by volunteers, by people who have a job and then they volunteer because they care. That can't be done. The other side is so professional and so well funded, you know. Of course, the one advantage that we have is that we are telling the truth, and they have to build lies all the time. So it's a lot easier for us to do this. And to duplicate this idea, and of course, I think the vision is that once it is up and running in Washington, D.C., it will be replicated in other places. But we have to present it in a compelling way to decision makers, to the people in these offices, in the halls of power, to make them understand what it is that we're talking about and how it's going to be beneficial for everyone. So the fact that the entire world, and it's not just the Arab world, the entire world, I mean, African countries, Asian countries, I mean, Indonesia is planning to normalize, Pakistan is planning to normalize, all these countries that you would assume wouldn't are planning to normalize with Israel. Until this happens in every single country, then we're not going to see change. So it's really up to us to create that, to change that environment internationally. That's how we do it.
If we could pass the mic, please. But before we do, we have questions that came on a WhatsApp group, the Friends of the Rainbow Theatre WhatsApp group. There's a question from Zaid Abu Ode saying, "Welcome to Jordan, Miko. We appreciate your work tremendously. Zionism rendered the Israeli society violent and completely psychotic. Do you think there could ever be peace without dismantling Zionism?"
Well, Zionism is an ideology. What we need to dismantle, once we dismantle the apartheid regime and we have a free democratic Palestine with equal rights, now education has to come into place. I mean, this is something that's really, really important. I think for many people, the notion of having a free Palestine is the end. No, that's base camp. That's the first step. Now we need to deal with education. Now we need to teach humanity. Now we need to teach human rights. Now we need to put in place mechanisms to fix everything that was destroyed, to bring back Palestine, because people don't even know that there was a Palestine. You know what I mean? So all of these things need to happen, not to mention, like I said, the right of return. All these things happen once we have a free Palestine with an elected government, with an elected parliament that represent the people, all the people. Now we can start to function. Then we create a constitution, and then we start building on that. So the first step is to dismantling apartheid. Then Zionism will be dismantled because it's a question of education. And that's when you dismantle the racism. And again, I'll say this, I said it several times, I think South Africa presented, it's not the only place, but certainly they presented us with a roadmap on how to do these things.
Over there.
Hello, my name is Imad Malhas. Thank you for everything that you are doing and for speaking the truth. So following up on what Sharif said, it seems to me that taking the gospel or spend to Washington while in Israel proper, where you come from, is where the mind needs to be changed. So you speak about regime in Israel, but there are 7.3 million Israelis living in Israel. We're not talking about a bad government or a left or a right or what you have. We've witnessed recently that nobody is asking to stop the war. We used to have folks, of course, that would say, no, you shouldn't be killing the Palestinians. Nobody in Israel is voicing any concern after 120 days and massacres. They are concerned, of course, about their hostages, which is fair and right. But how, Ramallah is like, 40 kilometers from Tel Aviv. How can we influence the Israelis? Because without them, if you go to the moon, the power that they have and the weakness of the Palestinians in terms of international influence from Western world is going to be very difficult. Why, from your perspective, aren't there voices like you in Israel? So you come here and all you say is spot on. We've been talking about what you're saying for decades. We've heard it, we lived it, we studied it, and you're speaking God's truth, right? But that really doesn't change anything at the end of the day. Yes, we can organize. Yes, we can boycott. Yes. But it's not changing Netanyahu here or a few fanatics. 7.3 million Israelis and maybe 7 million Palestinians in between the land that's between the river and the sea. Please tell us a little bit about how many are there like you, and how can we somehow wish for 1 million like you to be in Israel, where it counts?
That's a very good question, and it's a question that I hear a lot. In Germany after World War II, suddenly nobody was a Nazi. Nobody was a Nazi. In apartheid, in South Africa, after the fall of apartheid, there were no racists. Everybody loved Nelson Mandela. Everybody adored Nelson Mandela after apartheid fell. And the reality is that it doesn't happen as a result of convincing. It happened because these people were brought to their knees. And that's what we're talking about. And I know it sounds harsh, but it's a lot less harsh than what is happening in Gaza right now. And so unless Israeli society, and this is my deep belief, unless Israeli society or any other racist society or fascist society, unless those elements are brought to their knees and forced to change, not forced to change, but change is forced upon them. And then usually they get up the next morning and they see, well, the sky hasn't fallen and their life is actually better too. That's the only way to do it. It's not about convincing. It's about forcing it down their throats and giving them no other option. That's how change will happen. And then eventually they will change, and you'll see. After Palestine is free, you won't find any Zionists. They all pretend like they loved peace and they loved Palestinians their whole, their entire lives. That seems to be the process.
Can we pass the mic? Yes, while you get the mic, there's another question from Mu'tazim Khimar. What does... Look at the back. What? Yeah, but I just have a question from the online questions. The mic is passed. We'll get to you. Oh. What does a liberated Palestine look like?
What is liberated Palestine? I think the reason people I don't think anybody in this room has a problem necessarily seeing it, but I think for people outside of this realm that don't know that there was a Palestine before 1948, it's impossible to envision what a liberated Palestine is. And I think one of the missions that certainly this initiative of Dar al-Hurriya is taking on is to demonstrate, you know what they say, أخذوها مفروشة, to demonstrate what it was that was taken, because people don't know. People take it, for example, you know, Tabariya and Haifa and Yafa and Lid and Ramle, Bir Sabi. These are all Palestinian cities. They were all there. Jerusalem, not to mention. Who built them? You know, the world was doing business and trade with Palestine. Palestine was a thriving country, a thriving economy, a thriving culture, but nobody knows. Somehow, after May 15th, 1948, the world was struck with amnesia. Nobody remembers that there was a Palestine. So part of the mission needs to be, and I think it's equally important, to demonstrate what Palestine was so that people can understand what Palestine can be. And one of the reasons that Israel is causing so much destruction to Palestinian monuments, to Palestinian architecture, to Palestinian, you know, anything, any monuments, any remnants, any memories of Palestinian history, they're destroying it. Archaeology, they're destroying it because they don't want people to remember what was before. So I think that's part of that's an equally important part of the mission, is to show people what it was like. I mean, Zahir al-Omar, so few people, I mean, outside of the Palestinian community, nobody knows. Even many young Palestinians have never heard of Zahir al-Omar and what Palestine was like and the history before that and so on. And the literature is out there, but it needs to be done in a more, you know, in a more aggressive way. So I think a liberated Palestine will you know, that's what liberated Palestine looks like. It looks like a free Palestine.
The mic, please, to our, yeah.
Thank you very much. My name is Thamer. This is not out of despair, but I just want to understand something. I'd like to bring you back to BDS, please. And I think the example that you give continuously is about South Africa. But I think there are dissimilarities between the situation of South Africa and the situation of Palestine. And I'd like to understand from you if there is any chance of us actually influencing through BDS and similar movements what's happening in the world, because it's, you know, when you look at what happened and what led to the dismantling of apartheid in South Africa, I don't know if the same environment and the factors exist today to replicate this and do the same with the Israeli apartheid regime. So, I mean, if you look at the US, for example, how can we get the US on our side? South Africa had almost no country on its side, which made it fall to its knees eventually. Is this plausible? Is this something that can happen? I'm just asking because, you know, we live in a state of despair, especially today when we see the double standard being employed vis-a-vis what is happening in Gaza.
So I'll say a couple of things about that. It's a very important question. People forget that South Africa ruled all of Southern Africa. It had gold, uranium, and nuclear weapons, among many, many, many other resources. The world loved South Africa. Banks loved South Africa. Nobody wanted to boycott South Africa, certainly not the Europeans. And eventually, you know, they ended up, like you said, they ended up on their knees. Now, certainly Palestine is different in many ways. Certainly the Zionists have learned a lot from what happened in South Africa and strengthened their game to prevent a lot of what happens, like the whole idea of legislating and criminalizing the call for boycott against Israel. Criminalizing that is one of these great Zionist ideas and equating that with anti-Semitism. So they've learned from that and now they're improving their campaigns. And they're doing very well, but it's because they're organized. So how do we change? We change by creating, I believe, and again, I believe in this concept of creating an institution that is dedicated to that. Dedicated to that. You know, I don't need to tell you this, the Palestinian community here in Jordan has done incredible stuff. I mean, it's an incredible community of wealth and contribution to the country in which they live and so on. I mean, how hard would it be to create something like that here with all the great minds that are, that are operating on all these other different arenas? And this, like I said, the focus that I'm involved in is doing that in the United States. But the way we bring about this, I believe, this, influence, this change, and is through an institutionalized effort, which again, doesn't exist. Like we said earlier, Palestinians aren't orphans, and the Palestinian case is an orphan. So I believe that's how we do it. I think, however, in the comparison, the challenges that were faced by South Africa are far greater than the challenges that we face in Palestine. At the end of the day, when apartheid collapsed, Nelson Mandela became president, and there were some 40 million impoverished black Africans who never had the chance to go to school. Think about that. That's an enormous task. An enormous task. We don't have that in Palestine. We have two societies. The only reason Palestinians are poor is because of apartheid. Every other person in Gaza is a PhD even. I mean, the levels of education. And that is not the challenge. The challenge is to get rid of the apartheid and then build on these two societies that are highly educated, like I said earlier, and could function very, very well in a democracy the next day, pretty much. So how we do it by creating something that presents that as a possibility and is focused financially, intellectually, strategically on that and nothing else, just like the Zionists have done everywhere else. I mean, the Zionists have over 40 diplomatic missions in Africa. After all the damage that the Zionists have done in Africa, why would they allow the Israeli flag to be flown in any capital in Africa, or in Latin America and so on? But they have institutions that focus on presenting their case in a very compelling way in all the right places and all the right capitals. Palestine doesn't have that. And in my view, replicating that as much as we can is the key to bringing about the change. There's somebody in the back.
Yeah, somebody in the back, please, if you can give the mic to the gentleman in the back. Yeah.
Miko, can you give us an update on your organization, Palestine House of Freedom in DC, and how it plans to make an impact in the US?
And what was the second part? And
How it plans to make an impact on US elected officials.
Okay, so a few years ago, it became, I had this epiphany, and I finally realized that there's this huge void in Washington, D.C. I live in the city, in Washington itself. You see embassies and cultural buildings, thousands of buildings for Turkey and for Russia and for every other country. And there's no Palestine. There's not a single Palestinian flag, not a single Palestinian building, nothing. Well, how is an American politician, let's say an American politician that has the best of intentions, how are they supposed to make an informed decision on Palestine unless they're presented with a place, with a staff, with the education, and on and on and on, that presents the Palestinian case? How are they going to do that? So I got together with some Palestinian friends in Washington. I started talking to my brother Isa Amro and others in Palestine. By the way, all the people that were featured in that one clip earlier are all part of the Dar al-Hurriya kind of larger advisory board, if you will, so that there's a connection, direct connection, which I think doesn't exist with other organizations, to the actual major activists on the ground in Palestine. So the work that we do in Washington, D.C. is amplify their voice, express their needs, and their vision for a free Palestine. We're just the microphone, and we're the ones doing the work to present it in a strategic way, professional way in Washington, D.C. So how do you do that? Well, we identified three things. Education. So again, I mentioned I said education, advocacy, and then amplifying the Palestinian voice. Those are three things, okay? In the absence of a comprehensive plan to continuously educate on the Palestinian issue so that every member of Congress, every journalist, every member of the diplomatic corps, and the American public receive on a daily basis enormous amounts of information about Palestine. They're never going to know what Palestine is, and they're never going to, to them it's not going to work, So we have to have, so that's the plan. Those are the three elements that we're going to be working on. And then to have an actual location with a flag, with Dar al-Hurriya written on it, where people can come to, and they can listen to lectures, and see exhibits, and be invited to cultural events, and everything surrounding Palestine, so that Palestine is placed front and center. That's how it plans to do it. Now, like I said earlier, we have one tool that the other side would die to have and will never have. And it's the truth. Thank you. It's the truth. So it's a lot easier for us to present a compelling case for Palestine. And other groups do advocacy. It does exist. But these are smaller groups, and a lot of their work is done by volunteers, and people are not necessarily working together strategically, and so we see the results, And even now, there's a great deal of advocacy being done in the US now, in the capitals, with what is happening in Gaza. A lot of emails, a lot of letters are being sent, a lot of phone calls are being made, a lot of protests. And what was it, a couple of weeks ago, the US Congress passed a resolution that rejecting Zionism is anti-Semitic. So obviously the message needs to be tweaked, right? Obviously the message is not. So we need to all work together, and there's no place to do that. There's no institution that is dedicated to that. And when you look at the different missions of the different organizations, they all have the missions the way they found it best to express what they want to do. Our vision is a singular vision, a free democratic Palestine from the river to the sea. It has to be made clear because that is the path to peace. So in short, and again, we can talk about this later more if people want, but in short, that's the idea. And so we need the building, we need the staff, we need the training, we need professionals. Of course, we need to be able to pay for all of that. Otherwise, none of it's going to work. It's not going to happen on its own. And then I firmly believe, that the sooner we begin, the sooner we're going to start seeing results, even in a place that is so heavily Zionized like Washington, D.C. I absolutely believe it. And again, the information that I have, the opinions that I have, are based on, like I said, the work that is done and that I've had the honor to do with people like Isa Amro and the people that you saw in the movie, Bassem Tamimi and Manal and Omar al-Ghubari from Zukhrot and many, many others throughout all of Palestine. So we have voices from the Naqab, from Lid, from Yafa, from Nabi Saleh, Hebron, on, all the way through Gaza and so forth, that present this. And so it's a collaboration. It's a collaboration, but the overriding idea is accepted by everyone, that this is something that we have to do, and we have to do it yesterday. We have to do it yesterday, and the sooner we begin, the sooner we're going to see results. And I believe we will see results very quickly.
We have time for 3 questions. Yes.
Hello, my name is Aoun Al-Sous. My question to you is, if you look at the street all over the world, almost, they're all pro-Palestine or against what Zionism are doing. But if you look at the governments, they're all pro-Israel. And this is unfortunate. Now, if you look at the Arab world, they are running after normalization, most of the governments. Plus, even the Palestinian autonomy, they are doing the same thing. So you are saying that you want the public to get united and to work against the Zionism movement and against all these things. It seems like we need a political act from the governments. Some things have to be changed by the government ruling. Democrats, Republicans, German, Europe, etc., the European Union. If there is no political will, nothing will happen. That's one thing. Second, you are talking about having one state solution from the river to the sea. You know that they call it anti-Semitism by saying that. Maybe they call you self-hatred Jew. I'm not sure. Because that's the terms are used against anyone who is saying something, he's Jew, but he says something against, like Michael Baraham, maybe you heard of him, Noam Chomsky, etc., etc. All this. Jimmy Carter himself said it once, there is no two-state solution anymore after all these settlements in Palestine. So now what you're saying is probably the right thing to do is if we go, as you said, South African path. Maybe one solution. The question is, how can we achieve that?
So you're right. I mean, the problem that exists all around the world, we see it everywhere. We see public support for Palestine, and then the big gap, and then the decision makers who are all pro-Israel or very pro-Israel. And again, I'll tell you what I said when I was in Brussels at the European Parliament. Obviously the message is not getting through. That means we're not doing enough, And I'm not talking about Palestinians. I'm talking about the people who live, in other countries. And the Arab countries, the Arab states, they've been mentioned a few times. If we're an Arab leader right now, we're placed in a very difficult spot, because we see what was done to Arab countries that dared to stand clearly with Palestine. We saw Iraq, and we saw Yemen, and we saw Libya, and on and on and on. And then we're seeing other countries. And so what is the responsible thing to do? And I think this country has learned and has done a brilliant job in walking this very fine line and trying everything they can. I mean, I don't think any country more than Jordan has tried to somehow negotiate this very difficult situation and try to appeal to the other side to, make peace and to work together. And obviously the other side is not paying attention. So, I mean, I don't know that there's a reason to blame Arab countries more than anybody else. I mean, there's a problem here. And the problem is that there's popular support for Palestine, and it's not reaching the halls of power. And again, it's about, I think, looking at what we've done so far, learning from the mistakes, and saying, well, how are we going to bridge that gap? How do we break this glass ceiling so that we reach the halls of power, so that we can influence in the direction that needs to be influenced? And again, I think it's when we think about it, it shouldn't be that hard, because we're talking about something that's going to be helpful to everybody, including the countries that surround Palestine. So again, it's about working smart. It's not necessarily about how much effort we put out, but how smart that effort is.
Okay, one more question from the audience, because I have one question. What's up? There's this little young lady over here, please. Yeah, yes.
Hi, my name is Haya, and my question is, as a pro-Palestinian, how did you become known for your decision, and were you supported by your family and friends?
What was the first part of the question?
As a pro-Palestinian, how did you become known for your decision?
How you become famous? She wants to become famous.
No. How did you become known for your decision?
Oh, how did I become known? Okay. And the second part is about my family? Okay. So, yeah, that's a good question. Thank you. So, I became known, I wrote a book. And the book, the story of the book and the story of my life doesn't make sense, so people paid attention. Because I come from the other side, supposedly, and the title of the book is The General Son and The Journey of an Israeli Palestine. Those are that's a very strange combination. And so what happened was, as soon as the book came out, I had another life completely. I was not an activist. I had a whole other career. I had a whole other life. You'll have to read the book if you want to know what it was. And then one day when the book came out, I was faced with this reality that I had to choose. I could either continue my other life or start speaking and acting and being an activist, because the requests for lectures and the interest suddenly became enormous, and interviews and so on. So I thought this was the right thing to do, was to do this, and that's why I chose to do it. My family, families can be complicated, and so again, and October 7th was a watershed moment. Up to October 7th, in my case, there was kind of a detente. We decided that, the model that we chose, that I believed in, was that, we do what we do, but then, we have a family and we maintain the family relationship. So whenever I was in Palestine, all my activist friends knew Friday, 6 p.m., I go with my family and we have a Friday night dinner. And they don't ask me, they don't tell, that's fine. And within my family, there was the whole range of opinions. Not quite as crossing the line as me, but pretty much the range. After October 7th, that was it. I was notified by my family that that's it. They completely disconnected their relationship with me after October the 7th, which of course is very painful and very sad, but what are you going to do? That's kind of the decision that was made. So it's like I said, family is complicated. You have to figure out how to negotiate. And I get this question a lot from Jewish audiences in America. Suddenly somebody realizes, discovers Palestine, and they don't know what to do with their family. So you just have to negotiate it as best you can, and then obviously there's time of crisis that are a little bit tougher, and then there's times that are easier. But as far as my story, that's how my story went. So thank you for that question.
Thank you. Miko, one last question from the WhatsApp group comes from Kareem Habash. He says, don't you think that the Muslim, Christians, and Jews that have been living in the land of Palestine for hundreds of years are now the victim of the establishment of the State of Israel that obviously serves the Western and Zionism goals?
Absolutely, and I'll tell you, and I'll say more than that. You asked me when we were back there if I'm working on another book, and I am, and the book I'm working on is about this phenomenon of the anti-Zionist ultra-Orthodox Jews. And it's a fascinating story of a Jewish community that preceded the State of Israel. The ultra-Orthodox community in Palestine preceded the State of Israel, rejected the State of Israel, rejected Zionism going way back to when Zionism was invented. When the State of Israel was established, they asked to be given a special status. They did not want to be they did not want to be citizens of the state. They reject the army, and you have huge communities of ultra-Orthodox Jews around the world, most notably in around New York, but also in London and other places, that are out there protesting with us every single time. They come, and people see these Jews, who look like Jews. I mean, they're Orthodox Jews. They've got the beards, and suddenly they're wearing banners that say Free Palestine and dismantle the State of Israel. So yes, absolutely, Jews are equally victims, and of course, everybody that was in Palestine, that resided in Palestine, knows that in Hebron, and Isa Amr will tell you about this even more, in Jerusalem, the relations between Jews and Muslims were good relations. They were neighborly relations. They still have memories of these things. I'll tell you one little more episode from this research that I've been doing, and I know we've got to go. There's a famous anti-Zionist rabbi in Jerusalem. He was still alive when I was growing up. His name was Rabbi Amram. And he was really like a thorn in the side of the Zionists. He was protesting all the time. And they were scared of him. They hated him. Of course, he was he never hurt a soul, never carried a gun. And there was an interview done with him, and a book was published in Hebrew. And I read it, and he was interviewed by one of his students. And the question that he asked him was, what would you do if you were in charge? And Rabbi Amram said, the first thing I would do is I would ask the Arabs to come back. And the student said to him, what? Are you crazy? They'll kick us out. They'll throw us in the sea. They're terrorists. He said, who told you this nonsense? He said, my family was in Hebron. We lived as neighbors. We had good relations. Then we moved to Jerusalem. We had good relations. We always had good relations. We never had any violence until the Zionists came and began to terrorize us and brought violence and terrorism to the Holy Land. So I absolutely agree with the statement that was made. Thank you,
Miko, I'd like to thank you again for this conversation. Before we leave, in 10 seconds, just your final thoughts. 10 seconds, 15 seconds.
My final thoughts, I think, many of you are Palestinians, so, you know this, and I'm sure you know most of what I was saying. I really believe that two things. One is that the vision of a free, democratic Palestine with equal rights is doable, and it can be done sooner than what most people think. So certainly within all of our lifetimes. I said this once, and there was an old lady in the room. I absolutely have no doubt in that.
Yeah.
I think that it's absolutely doable. I think that we're all going to be judged by where we stood and how hard we worked. This is going to be, our future generations are going to judge us, just like they judge people who lived during other terrible regimes, and they're going to want to know what we did. And I mentioned Isa many, many times. I want to see a reality now, where his safety is guaranteed, where his life is guaranteed, where people put that as the number one priority, that he and others like him and the children of these wonderful, courageous people, their safety is guaranteed, that we are there. People from around the world are there in the midst to make sure that they are safe and they can walk freely in their homeland. That's my final thought. Thank you.
Inshallah. Miko, again, it was a pleasure to have this conversation at this very difficult time. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us. You could get your books signed now at the mezzanine. Once again, thanks you all, and have a good night.